Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you all to the Chartered Institute of Linguists webinar, 5 Ways Podcasts Can Help Linguists Research and Expand Their Business, presented by Michelle Dieter. My name is Sahila Phillips and I'm the Events and Networks Manager. During this webinar, you can ask questions by posting them on the questions panel just to the right of your screen, and at the end of Michelle's presentation, the Q&A session will follow. All attendees will receive a certificate and a link to the recording within 2 working days, and CIOL members, you can log this webinar as your CPD activity on My CPD. But for now, I'd like to welcome our speaker. Hi, Michelle.
Hi there.
Hello there. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass controls over to you now, so you can begin.
There we go. Looks good. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, in that case, let's get rolling. My name is Michelle Dieter. I'm an interpreter, translator, and a teacher. My working languages are Mandarin Chinese and English. I've been listening to podcasts since about 2013, and I have between 40 and 50 different podcasts in my feed at a time. So I'm always trying new things and changing it up. I have a microphone and I have been a guest on other podcasts 3 times. So that's basically my experience with podcasts. I do not have a degree in podcasting. I haven't done research on the market of podcasting. So if you are expecting that today, I apologize. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I wanted to just explain what a podcast is. So a podcast is an audio feed that people can subscribe to. Conventional podcasts are shows that have 1 or more hosts. People can listen to that show wherever they feel like, and they can use a smartphone or a desktop computer or a laptop or a tablet. The most fun thing is that you don't have to listen live. You can listen when you have time. And many podcasts put up their episodes on a regular schedule, but there's also a lot of hobbyist podcasters out there who have day jobs. They might update their podcast irregularly. And again, since people can listen to podcasts while doing other activities, they're very popular at the moment. I listen while I'm on the train, while I'm on the plane, while I'm doing a puzzle, while I'm doing the dishes, or even sometimes weeding in my garden. So there's a few different types of podcasts. It's very popular to do news bulletins, panel debates, or one-on-one conversations. There might be an interview show, so a different guest comes on every episode. Or it could be one topic per episode with multiple people interviewed. For example, this episode, we're talking about large numbers. And this episode, we're talking about the names for different family members in your family. Sometimes a podcast is literally a radio show that's dropped into your podcast feed. So for example, the BBC has some podcasts. NPR in the United States, National Public Radio, has podcasts. And there's a similar collection of different shows you can listen to in Germany, in France, probably for just about every country that does public radio. The one-on-one conversations are probably the type of podcast that I listen to the most. They're more fun. They're not necessarily as informative. But for me, podcasting is also something for relaxing. And last but not least is audio drama. So that is more like storytelling in the form of a podcast. So how do you get a podcast online? The podcast is published on a website like SoundCloud, but it could be a different website. The backbone of that process is an RSS feed. So as an example, this is the feed for a Spice Girls podcast. And you can see in that URL, it says soundcloud.com. So that show is hosted on SoundCloud. But it also appears in every other podcast place. For instance, when I listen to podcasts, I'm using an app that's called Pocket Cast. It's not SoundCloud, but I can still find this Spice Girls podcast. How does this work? Basically, all the apps, all the sites are tracking the RSS feed, that URL you see above. So pretty much all sites and all apps read the list of feeds that's on Apple Podcasts. And then the podcast producer, like to summarize, the podcast producer chooses a platform to host its feeds. Then the platform submits the RSS feed to Apple. And then people who want to listen, download the podcast from their preferred platform, which is reading the list of feeds on Apple Podcasts. So that's how it goes. And one other thing, just keep in mind there's no wrong way to listen to a podcast. Unless you're listening to an audio drama or a history podcast, you don't have to start at episode 1. If you don't like it, you can just stop listening to an episode. You can stop following a show. That's absolutely fine. And you can always take it out of your feed. Most people listen at 1x speed, so at the speed that it was recorded. But if you're like my brother, who likes to get through a lot of episodes, you might listen on 1.2 speed or 1.3 speed or 1.5 speed. Just make it work for you. So again, most podcasts are on Apple Podcasts. This means if you have an iPhone or an Apple TV, it's a very easy way to start. You just search it inside one of those, like in the podcast app in your iPhone, and you're already ready to go. If you don't have an iPhone or Apple TV, don't worry. You can also find pretty much every podcast on Google Play, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and SoundCloud. And then also there's these specialty apps. So like I said, I have Pocket Cast. Another good one is Overcast. These apps just give you some nice little tricks like trim silence. So if there's no sound in the episode, it will cut it out and save me some time. Or you can do a sleep timer. So if I want to just kind of relax for half an hour, I can make the podcast stop after 20 minutes, half an hour, as I like. One other thing, if you become a paying subscriber to a podcast, you might get a special link. That means you don't have to listen to ads, or maybe the episode has some bonus content. That's just the unique RSS feed. So for example, I used to subscribe to They Walk Among Us, and on the website, like the subscriber website, it would give you instructions for how to get that feed onto your podcast app or place of choice. And that way you're getting something that can't be found by the general public, but maybe has some special perks. However, not all podcasts are on Apple Podcasts, or at least this is what I have found in my language pair. So some Chinese podcasts are only available on WeChat. That's a messaging app that is similar to WhatsApp. And some Chinese podcasts are only available on Himalaya, which is a kind of slightly different podcasting app because it does a lot more exclusive deals. Admittedly, Spotify has some podcasts that are exclusive, and so then you can't find them outside of Spotify. Very small podcasts that have not yet been vetted by Apple Podcasts might not be in those main podcast places. They will be eventually, though. And then also sometimes podcasts move. So for example, UN Radio has had a podcast for a while, and first it was only available on the news.un.org website. And then it moved to Apple Podcasts, and now you can get it in both places, which is excellent. Again, I'm not trying to sit at my desktop computer when I'm listening to a podcast. I want to be able to download it on my phone and then listen even if I'm not on Wi-Fi. And the UN News podcast is really excellent because it's available in 9 different languages, not just the 6 official UN languages. So the reason why I tell you that podcasts move is if you listen to every single episode in order, you'll notice the move. The host will tell you, by the way, in future, you have to find the podcast in a different place. But if you stop listening for a month or 2, you might not notice. So that did happen to me, and I had to figure out if the podcast was over or not. Sometimes podcasts end, which is of course sad. Keep in mind though, nearly all podcasts are free. This model can pose a problem because recording and editing take a lot of time and effort. It can be sad when your beloved podcast ends or goes on hiatus, but oftentimes you can follow that host doing another project, so you don't have to miss out on your favorite host that you like to listen to. So as an example, this is a picture of a YouTuber and podcaster called Brady Heron. He used to do a show called Hello Internet, but that is on long-term hiatus. And I was really sad about that because I like the style of interviewing that Brady Heron does. So specifically for that reason, I started listening to The Number File. And that is basically interviewing mathematicians. I don't do anything with math, but I just really enjoy the way Brady Heron asks questions. So I went ahead and put that in my podcast feed. I'm still enjoying it now. As another example, there used to be a podcast called Answer Me This, which was by 3 hosts, Helen, Ollie, and Martin. And they decided they didn't want to keep doing the show anymore. However, all 3 of them have different shows to listen to. So my favorite host is Helen Zaltzman, and I now listen to her other stuff. So you might be thinking, Michelle, why should I care about podcasts? I have a busy life. I don't want this. I mean, that's a fair question. Everybody has time constraints. So let me give you 5 reasons why podcasts might be a thing for you to check out. Reason number 1, or the first way that podcasts can help you, is that it can help you translate and find terminology. I was recently translating an adoption certificate, and I needed to check that I had the correct English term that was the equivalent of 收养父亲 and 收养母亲. I listened to just one episode of Divided Families and confirmed that it was adoptive father and adoptive mother. I will admit, though, listening was probably slower than just looking online. So for specific terminology, maybe podcast is not the fastest way to do it. However, podcasts can help you translate more generally. So sometimes just a show can provide help in terms of inspiration. Noble Blood is a podcast that I listen to. It's about royals in different countries. So kind of a history podcast, but with a certain angle. And the host, Dana Schwartz, is a fantastic writer. So sometimes I listen to this podcast and I borrow her phrasing when I'm stuck in a literary translation. So that's a little more indirect, perhaps, but I find that works really well for me. The second way that podcasts can help you is with interpreting. So sometimes I'll be interpreting for one keynote speaker, and that means my preparation can be targeted. As you probably already know, it's important for me to know that speaker's accent, and it's important for me to know what they talk about. So this has happened to me 3 times already. Maybe it's different in your language pair, but 3 times I had a keynote speaker, like a director or an author, who did not have any YouTube videos because YouTube is blocked in China. However, they had long interviews on podcasts, and so that still gave me the opportunity to hear their accent and to know what they like to talk about. In particular, there was a director, Mr. Jiang, who did a documentary, which was called We Are Smart in English. And so you might, if you just knew about the documentary, think that he likes to talk about factories and fashion and young people, but actually he's also very interested in economics and class and the gap between the rich and the poor. So fortunately, I learned that before starting interpreting. That helped me adjust how I was preparing for that particular interpreting assignment. Still, I would say most podcasts aren't suitable for simultaneous interpreting practice. Consecutive, sure, but not simultaneous, because usually the content is very dense, too much information at once. And often there might be background noise or background music, and I find that to be distracting. Podcasts can also help you develop teaching materials if you happen to be an interpreter trainer or some kind of teacher. This is still, I would say, part of the second way that podcasts help linguists, because this is related to interpreting for me. So recently, the DIPSI law topic was road traffic offenses. While I was trying to make a scenario, a dialogue for this topic, I discovered the podcast Time to Zero In. So when I was starting to write that dialogue, I thought, a small collision is probably the most likely scenario for the DIPSI. Then I listened to the 6 episodes of the podcast, really easy, and I realized that actually police do not normally get involved in a road traffic accident unless there's a serious injury or death, right? So I decided to change my scenario and involve a fatal collision to make it just a little bit more like what it's probably going to be like. The third way that podcasts can help you as linguists is just to help you be a better freelancer. So this podcast might be able to give you tips for being a freelancer. They might have discussions about work-life balance or even work-life clarity. And some podcasts are industry specific. So specifically for translators, we have 2 on the screen right now. I would highly recommend all 4 of these podcasts, and we'll go from left to right. So on the left, we have Back to Work, which is hosted by Merlin Mann and Dan Benjamin. Merlin Mann is perhaps an acquired taste. He sometimes jumps around in topics and he has really weird jokes, but I find him really interesting and also very entertaining. So it's worth listening to that. There's already hundreds of episodes. It's been going for a long time. So just see what you think about that, I guess. The second one is Smart Habits for Translators. That's hosted by two translators who are very interested in trying new tools and also just tweaking their business, tweaking their approach to translation. So they've just got really good advice on the latest book that you should read, or a new way of doing your invoicing, and even sometimes an app comes out and it's okay, but then the app gets updated and it's really good. So these are the kinds of people that check if the app actually got better and tell you, now it's worth your time, go download the app. Focus is also a really excellent podcast. When it started out, it was called Free Agents, and that's when I liked it the most. So for that one, I would say listen to episodes approximately 1 to 45, something like that. It's for any freelancer, but I find the hosts are really interesting. One of them is a writer, and one of them is like a legal consultant and tech writer. So that's close enough to translation that their advice is still really helpful. And last but not least is Meet the Translator by Dot Roberts. She does one interview per month, and Dot recently got her master's degree, and she's also in a different language pair than I am, so I find that her knowledge is really up to date. And yeah, that's just a really fun podcast to listen to. There's two other podcasts that I have not featured here. One is called the ATA podcast, so it's hosted by the American Translators Association. It's good, but it's very United States centric. So for example, the medical interpreting episode was specifically about how hospitals work in the United States. There's also one called Translators. It's okay, but a lot of the episodes are actually in Spanish and I don't understand Spanish. So I didn't want to recommend it to you without getting a full feel of the podcast. But if you're interested, Translators is spelled TRANSLASTARS. Translators. Now, the fourth way podcasts can help you is to increase your exposure, the exposure of you as a freelancer and your business. So chances are you probably have a friend who has a podcast, you just don't know it yet. So maybe you can be interviewed by that friend or by someone else who hosts a podcast. And this can lead to more people going to your website or people connecting with you on LinkedIn. Indirectly, that can lead to more business, and usually it doesn't cost you anything. So I've been interviewed on podcasts 3 times, as I said, and I was talking about a book that I had recently translated. So that just gave more advertising for the book and led people to buy it. That was really nice. However, maybe you think, I don't want to be interviewed. That sounds really anxiety inducing. There's other ways still to get involved and to increase your exposure. You could maybe ask to do transcriptions. So a lot of podcasts have transcriptions, but a lot of them don't because, again, it's hobbyists that are doing this. So maybe you could ask a podcast host, can I transcribe your podcast just in exchange for being credited for the work? If you do that, that could show that you have those skills, and that could turn into a future source of revenue. When you try to join an agency or something, it would be clear that you have high quality transcription skills. And you could choose the topic. You could approach a podcast host that you think, yes, this is what I want to learn about. So that way you're transcribing something in an area that maybe you wanted to learn more about anyway. And then you're getting a benefit, even if you're not getting directly paid for transcribing. So this podcast here, the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast, doesn't have any transcriptions yet. It's up for grabs. Also, the podcast by Dot Roberts does not have transcriptions yet. Dot does it all for free, so she knows she can't find someone or pay someone to do that. So let's move on to the fifth way. The fifth way you can help yourself as a linguist is by making your own podcast. Before you decide to do that, there's a few things that you should decide on. First, make sure you decide the theme or topic of your show, and then the regular format for each episode, then who your host or hosts will be, and then whether you will add to this feed indefinitely or if you're going to have a fixed number of episodes. Then you need to decide how you will record So what kind of software you're going to use, maybe Zoom, maybe Skype, maybe Audacity, where you'll record, either in a closet or in a studio. A picture here is of a closet because many, 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 many podcasters do not have access to a studio. And so the closet is the best option for creating a nice sound environment in a house that you already live in. And then you need to decide what you'll record with. And usually that just means a microphone, perhaps headphones, perhaps a microphone stand. So yes, making your own podcast is a lot of work, but it has benefits. So this is a picture of Dot Roberts. Again, she's the host of the Meet the Translator podcast. She said it's like marketing, networking, and CPD all rolled into one. So for her, there's just loads of benefits. Dot also says people see me as an expert in what I do because of the podcast. So sometimes you have enough exposure online, but you want to be able to show that you have certain skills or that you're an expert in the field, you have a certain level of experience. And that's what the podcast does really, really well for her. It depends on what format you do, but if you decided to do an interview style podcast, then basically you could get a personal webinar on whatever topic you want. Or you can just interview and learn about how somebody else started their career, or learn about whatever it is that you want to learn about. So you wouldn't get that otherwise. Maybe someone would not agree to talk to you for an hour and a half, unless they knew that that recording was going on a podcast, and that can be interesting and fun for people as well. So if you decide, yes, I want to do it, I want to start a podcast, these are Dot's tips for what you should do. The main thing is keeping the podcast going. Many podcasts don't get past episode 3. Also, podcast hosting costs about $12 a month. Dot hosts her podcast on Buzzsprout. That's one of many hosts, and that's probably the cheapest. It's $12 for 3 hours of audio per month. Dot says microphones are not too expensive. She got one secondhand from Facebook Marketplace. And Dot records her interviews remotely using Zoom, so the software is free. There's also free editing software like GarageBand for Apple products and Audacity for PCs. Dot used to edit the podcast herself, but it took too much time, so now she pays an editor to edit the podcast for her. And sometimes Dot has contributors, so she says listeners can contribute by recording notes on voice memos and then just emailing them to the podcast. So that's really nice. There's some interaction between the listeners and the host. And finally, Dot says that, yes, it's possible to put a podcast on Patreon to get subscribers or get some, support for her. But she wants to be available to everyone. So her podcast is completely free. You, if you start a podcast, might want to set up a Patreon account, or you might want to keep it free. That's something to maybe think about in advance. And finally, it's a good idea to schedule interview times in advance, because someone might be happy to do the podcast, but they're going to be busy and you don't want a scheduling clash. And then we have some other tips from the host of the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast, Angus Stewart. Angus says make sure Zoom is recording via your nice mic and not your laptop's built-in microphone. The sound difference is just really incredible. Also, try not to speak too quietly. If you want to yell for effect, make sure to move back or avoid doing it right into the mic. You don't want to hurt your poor listeners' ears. Another tip he has is to stay hydrated. If you're dehydrated, you'll have a saliva-filled dry mouth, and that can sometimes be heard on the recording. Yuck. Obviously, record somewhere quiet. We mentioned that before. And before you start, test to see if there's an echo. If you did have an echo, the thing to do is to put pillows up or some kind of fabric, clothing. That's the best way to reduce that echo in a room. Also, Angus says, remember that you can address the listeners as well as fellow hosts or guests. You can imagine that they are in the room. Also, podcast icons are tiny images, usually on phone screens. So make sure you use big, legible text for your podcast art. You've seen a couple of the images for podcasts before, and every time they put the name on the podcast, they make it really, really big. That's how you want to do it. Angus has more tips. We're not done yet. So some people will find your show through word of mouth, but most people will probably find it through a search For instance, just this morning, I wanted to see if there were any medical podcasts in Chinese, and so I went straight to Google for that. So that's why you should remember it's a good idea to have a title that matches your topic, because the search engine will be more likely to grab that. That's why Angus's podcast is called the Translated Chinese Fiction Podcast. You can tell that it's about Chinese fiction that has been translated. In contrast, I listened to a show called No Such Thing as a Fish, which is a really weird name. It's kind of a comedy podcast. It's kind of giving you facts, kind of like infotainment, I guess. But you cannot tell that from the name of the podcast. So they had to very, very slowly build up their fan base, I guess. And at this point, yes, they're very popular, but you would never guess what the podcast is about based on the name. Another thing is to watch your download stats. So tracking your subscriber count can be difficult, but you should be able to check the number of downloads. And you can do that maybe after a week that the episode comes out, and then a month after the episode comes out. Also, you should review which older episodes accumulate the most downloads over time, because this will indicate which topics interest people, and that can help you decide which topics to do in the future. Last but not least, Angus says, make sure you make something that you would want to listen to. I think that's really good advice. So I think just if you want to get into this deeper, probably the best thing for me to do is to just give you some links. So in terms of using a microphone, we'll get a little specific on that. But otherwise, we don't necessarily have to go into all the nitty-gritty. I think we would run out of time. So for using a microphone, again, make sure you buy a microphone rather than getting something using the microphone that's built in to your laptop. Use a microphone stand. If you have to, put it on your desk. That's what I'm doing right now. If you can, put the microphone stand on the floor. That way, if you bump your desk on accident, it won't pick up on the microphone. Figure out the distance that you should be from the microphone. So maybe that's, about 3 or 4 inches, maybe that's 5 or 6 inches, and try to keep in that distance the whole time, facing the microphone when you speak. Use headphones so you can tell how you sound. And is there anything else? Well, if you're fancy, you could buy a pop filter. Otherwise, be careful with your plosives, so your P's. That can pick up on a microphone a little too heavily, and that might not sound good. So again, for more tips, you can go to resonaterecordings.com. If you're just starting a podcast, the musicradar.com link below is really excellent, covers a lot of ground. Then we have the technical steps to recording with Zoom. Probably Zoom is the most popular way to record at this point because the host is definitely going to have it. And probably most guests have used Zoom at this point as well. So turbofuture.com describes how you can do that and how you can make sure that your guest has really good quality audio as well as you do. Then podcaster Helen Zaltzman, who I love so much, put up a YouTube video about her creative decisions on content. So it kind of describes how she decided to put the order of the show, why she does a little joke at the beginning, why she reads a word from the dictionary at the end, and how she decided to put her ads in certain places. So she does have ads that she reads out herself. It makes it more interesting and people are less likely to skip that way. Yeah, it's a really fun little video. So that's why I had to add it. I really like it. And finally, podcaster Marco Arment reviewed a lot of microphones. The microphone I'm using right now is recommended by Marco. So I'd recommend going to marco.org to see that. Also, every single microphone that he reviews, he uploaded a just brief little sound of himself talking and also his wife talking, so you can see what that microphone would sound like for a male voice and for a female voice. Okay, so I've spent most of this time looking at and talking about podcasts that are a useful way to learn new things or improve your business. But also, podcasts can be a nice form of entertainment. So I wanted to share with you some of my favorite podcasts that are in my feed right now. And we'll go from left to right. Illusionist is the podcast that's hosted by Helen Zaltzman that I listen to with great excitement every time there's a new episode. It's basically about the English language, but it's also talking about how language can change and how different people use language in different ways. If you don't know where to start, I would recommend episode 60. And then we have the Word Matters podcast. Again, it's about the English language. This one is hosted by 3 people who work for Merriam-Webster, which is an American dictionary. And I just find it really, really interesting. So some of the stuff they say kind of changes my mind about being a translator or just makes me appreciate my job differently. Also, it sounds like working for a dictionary is difficult but really interesting. So if I ever need to change jobs, that's what I'll try to do. And if you would like to start with a podcast, obviously you can start with episode 1. I would also recommend episode 88. Next on the list, we have Song Exploder. That is basically an interview podcast. Host Rishi K. Shirway interviews a musician, and they talk about how they got the inspiration for the song and how they started to write it and who they worked with. And then at the end, you get to hear the song. So that's really, really good. Recommended by a lot of music lovers. If you don't know where to start, you can start with episode 194. That's when he interviewed Dua Lipa. And it's just a really fun one to listen to. So I would start there. And then we have the Top 4 podcast. This is a totally silly show where a husband and wife couple talk about things that they like. I don't think there's very much to learn, but these people are approximately the same age as me and they grew up in the United States. So when I'm feeling homesick, it's like the best thing for me to listen to. It's a very personal recommendation, I'll admit. If you don't know where to start with, I would say School Supplies is a fun episode. Next, we have the Sinica podcast. This is in English, but it's all about China and China's relationship with other countries. It's been going on for a long time. I find it really interesting, and the guests are also super, super interesting. So if you're interested in learning more about China, especially like the hot take on what's happening right now in China, then I would recommend that podcast. The one that you can start with is when Peter Hessler gives a talk live at the next China conference. So if you just download the app and look for Peter Hessler, you'll find that. And then we have the No Such Thing as a Fish podcast. Like I said, it's a comedy podcast. It's based by the people who make QI, which is a pretty fun television show. That comes every Friday. And let me tell you, when it's Friday and I see it in the feed, I get very, very happy. Okay, we're down to the second row now. On the left, we have The Lonely Palette. I just started listening to it recently. It's hosted by an art history major, and it's mostly based on artwork that is in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. However, she always includes a link with a picture, so you can kind of look at the painting or look at the sculpture and then hear her describe it. I just find it really interesting in terms of the way she describes things. Also, you can indirectly learn about certain art movements. Also, they use contributions from visitors to the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. So you get a little bit of a sense of what an ordinary person would think when they first approach that work of art. So if you don't know where to start, I'd recommend episode 11. That's John Singer Sargent's The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. Sorry. Then we have the history of Byzantium. This is kind of following off the History of Rome podcast, which a lot of you might have heard of. If you are a history buff, start here. Or just if you want to know more about history from a long time ago, it's a good place to start. The host's voice is really relaxing. He sounds really nice. I just put Noble Blood on there again. So again, it's about royalty, princes, princesses, queens, and kings. And it just gives it a little bit of a spin. It makes the story interesting by imagining how that person might have felt in that moment. Yeah, I just find it really gripping, really nice. And then we have the You Are Good podcast. It's kind of a podcast about movies and feelings. So they just choose a movie to talk about, and then they also describe how they felt when they watched the movie, or also how they feel about things now. It's very, I don't know, very interesting. It makes me want to watch the films if I haven't already. If you don't know where to start, I would start with the Jurassic Park episode. And this is the original, okay, the one that came out in the 90s, not the new one. Then we have Maintenance Phase. This is a podcast that is kind of talking about fad diets, influencers who try to go on health things, but usually end up being canceled because they have terrible ideas. and just kind of, government decisions on health or like these bigger plans to try to help people that maybe are misguided. And I learn a lot from the podcast in terms of like statistics, how statistics are presented, um, how influencers can be charlatans, but also, it helps me review my own prejudices and my own opinions about health and people of different body sizes. Honestly, it's really good. It's really interesting. And again, if you don't know where to start, there's an episode on Halo Top, which is a certain type of ice cream. So you can try that one out. And finally, I had to at least include one episode or one podcast from NPR because they do a lot of really nice shows in English. The Planet Money podcast is about finance and economics, but each time the story is told in a really engaging way. So if that's the specialization that you wanted already, or if you find that kind of stuff interesting, definitely add this podcast to your feed. You could start with episode 1547, which is about onions. So there's a lot of episodes there to go through. I'm also going to quickly recommend just a few podcasts in Chinese. I realize that some of you may not listen to Chinese, so I won't spend too much time on this. 故事 FM is a very long-running podcast and kind of talks to more normal people rather than experts. It's really interesting. UN Radio in Chinese, the episodes are really short and can be topical, so I find that one really nice. I can listen to an episode twice in a row and really practice on my listening skills. 很日常 is a podcast that my friend does. She lives in the UK, so I find her experience of being an expat living in the UK and being an interpreter just really interesting. 原来是这样 is kind of like a science communication podcast. Used to be on Apple Podcasts, now you can only find it on WeChat or Himalaya. Museolog, or 博物志, is about someone who's doing a degree in museum studies, and she visits museums all around the world and talks about, kind of what she thought about the museum. So that's fun. And finally, 电影不无聊 is a podcast where like 3 or 4 hosts, depends on the day, will talk about Chinese films that have recently come out. So again, there's just a lot of really different topics, really interesting stuff out there. If Chinese isn't your language, just keep asking for recommendations. Ask your friends, ask on social media, just randomly search something in the internet. You'll be very surprised what comes up. It could be something really good. Okay, so that's really all I have to tell you today. Maybe a little bit faster than I intended to, so I hope you understood everything, but I'm here for you. If there's something you didn't understand, I'll say it again. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them now. If you, for whatever reason, can't think of your question now, or you realize you have a question later, you can contact me on my website, michelledieter.com, or you can add me on LinkedIn. Please just, if you add me on LinkedIn, add a note telling me how you met me. Otherwise, I won't know that we haven't met each other in person and we're meeting through the webinar. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. So we have had a few questions that have come in. So to start with, you mentioned that you've been a guest on 3 podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
These all to discuss the book you translated and who approached you?
Sure. So I was a guest on 2 podcasts, but 3 times. I might join the 很日常 that I just mentioned because my friend hosts that podcast.
Okay.
But let's start with what I've done so far. So the first time I was ever on a podcast was for my friend's publishing podcast. She's based in Oregon in the United States, and she thought it was interesting to look from the translator's perspective of what happens in the process of a book being translated. So she approached me, and I said, absolutely, more than happy to. And so we chose that book to focus on, but mainly because the podcast was about publishing rather than about language or about translation. I was kind of giving a peek for people outside of the industry to know what happens, what that process is like from my perspective. And then the other 2 times was with the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast by Angus Stewart. First time was for the same book, just kind of promoting that book and talking about crime fiction in general. And the second time, I translated a couple of short stories, passed those on to Angus, and we talked about them. It was a female author that I really, really like. And basically, the plan was to try to build up some interest in this author so eventually I could pitch the book to a publisher. But that hasn't gone anywhere yet. So that was just an opportunity to talk about translation in the end, which is still nice, you know, and still, again, shows me as an expert in the field, shows that I have skills in translation, still lots of benefits, even if it didn't lead to the book deal that I was hoping it would lead to.
Sure. Okay. And what would you say the impact or the return is if you attend as a guest on a podcast compared to actually just putting out your own podcast?
Sure. So as a guest, you're more likely to have kind of an indirect benefit. For example, I'm not based in the United States right now, and the people who are going to listen to the hybrid, just a second, what is it called? The hybrid Pub Scout podcast about indie publishing and traditional publishing. They're maybe not interested in contacting me directly. Totally makes sense. So it's a very indirect payback of people learning about me. For instance, maybe an agency is going to see my name, wonder if I'm a legit translator, and then see that my name pops up again and again in Google searches in 5 or 6 different places. So I think that's very indirect, but still really important. You're not just finding me on Find a Linguist. I have a personal website. I've been a host, I've been a guest on podcasts, and all that just builds up to show that I'm a reliable person. And then for the when I was on the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast, it did like directly lead to book sales, and I do get royalties on that book. So, you know, maybe I got $1. I've not had it where I don't ask, to be fair, but I've not had it where a customer says, "Oh, I heard of you on this podcast, and for that reason, I'm specifically asking you to translate this book for me." But that might be more likely if I went on a show like Meet the Translator, where everybody there knows exactly what they're looking for, and the listeners are more likely to be other translators or maybe project managers, things like that.
Okay, great. You did mention earlier 2 podcasts on translation. Can you recommend any on interpreting?
Ooh, I haven't found many yet. So the Meet the Translator podcast, she has interviewed, I think, 2 interpreters so far. So she
Okay.
kind of folds that in. Sorry about
Mhm.
that. The ATA podcast, again, has some interpreters that it talks about, but it's just a little bit US focused. So sometimes that can be a drawback, I would say.
Cool.
And otherwise, I'm still looking. So if someone can put that as a question in the chat, Sohaila will read it out and then we will all have an answer. I'd be more than happy to share that with everybody.
Perfect. And then lastly, how can a podcast be monetized?
Sure. So there's a few ways that a podcast can be monetized. You can take the approach that Dot takes and say, well, because I'm getting these benefits from marketing and networking, and because I'm unable to pay the guests that take the time to be on my podcast, I don't want to ask anybody for money. However, you could say, I would like a little bit of money for this. And also, you know, podcasts cost money in terms of hosting. You have to pay every month just to keep the podcast available for your listeners. So maybe you do want a little bit of money. You could do something that's kind of one-off donations. For instance, there's buymeacoffee.com. And if someone likes the podcast, they can just send a little bit of money your way, enough to presumably buy a coffee. Or you can do something more regular, such as a Patreon. So that's what Angus does. He has a Patreon account, and I give money to that podcast, just $1 a month. That helps support his hosting costs. And in exchange, Angus does extra episodes that nobody else can listen to. You only get that if you're a subscriber. Another way to monetize a podcast is obviously ads. So you're going to need a minimum number of listeners before you can get an ad agency that's interested in you reading ads. But once you do that, there's then 2 ways to do ads. You could have the ones that kind of automatically download, and those will be pre-recorded by whoever. The app that you use will kind of tell what country you're located in, and will then give you a podcast in English or in German or in Italian based on where you are. Or even better is the kind of inside the episode readouts of a certain product. So for instance, Harry's is a shaving company that just is on a whole lot of podcasts, or Squarespace. And so in this case, the podcast host is talking about using that product and how much they like it, and how great it is. So if the listener is already a fan, really trusts the host, they're much more likely to be able to translate that ad into sales. Those are really popular. So yeah, there's really a range of ways. You can keep it really simple with just the donations on something like buymeacoffee.com. You can make it something a little bit more complicated, like paying subscribing, but you don't have to do that yourself. There's platforms such as Patreon that can kind of take the administrative aspects of it away, so you just do your content. And then if you're really big, yes, advertising is a way to make a fair amount of money. Some people are just podcasters. That's like their full-time job.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And just to comment, one of our listeners has said that I think Tess Whitey or Whitty is a marketing guru for language professionals, and that apparently she has interviewed interpreters. And
Great. Yeah.
someone else has commented, yeah, someone's just commented saying that they came along to this webinar because they've always been a fan of getting information via an audio format. So radio
Yeah.
podcasts existed. So yeah, I think definitely either people obviously have started to listen to podcasts, or yeah, they'll obviously start searching to see what they can find and get into. So that was really interesting. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you for that reminder. Tess Whitty, I just double checked. She has a podcast that I have heard before and would recommend. It's called Marketing Tips for Translators. So that's what
Ah,
you would want to search for if you were in Google or if you're in your podcast app, Marketing Tips for Translators. And again, so some of hers are interviews, some of hers are just describing, like, this is the way I do my invoices now, or this is a book I read, stuff like that. So thank you for that reminder. Whoever contributed that, thank you very much.
perfect. And then someone else has just commented on a podcast called Brand the Interpreter.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know if others have heard of that.
Let's see. Yep, that's a thing. It looks like it updates quite regularly as well. So Brand the Interpreter, go check that out. See, that's the exciting thing. That's why I always have a lot of podcasts in my feed, and I'm constantly jumping around listening to things that are relaxing, things that teach me things, all sorts, all sorts.
And then someone else has just commented, just saying that it sounds like if you were to put a podcast together, so, you know, have a series of episodes, it does sound very time consuming. So
Yeah.
therefore, it's probably more efficient to be a guest on someone else's podcast. What do you think?
I totally agree that it's a big commitment. And as Dot says, a lot of podcasts don't get past episode 3. So if you don't have a plan, or if you don't have, like, let's say 3 hosts, and every episode 2 of the 3 hosts are there, it would be difficult and expensive to constantly come up with content and constantly be able to do things. So yes, being a guest is probably better. But cold calling a really, really popular podcast and being like, hey, I recently translated a book, can I be in your podcast? That might not work either. Make sure you're a listener, make sure you know if it's an interview format podcast or if it's a one-on-one conversation and they never have guests. Or like I said, just start simple. Start with people who you happen to know. Maybe just put a call out on social media. I am excited by the idea of being interviewed for a podcast. Does anybody host a podcast? Can I be on your show? I know it sounds geeky. It sounds like a silly thing to ask, but people are really nice. Just give it a go and start there. Maybe if that kind of gives you the bug and then you want to start your own podcast after that, that would be a better way to go about it.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Michelle, thank you so much for an informative talk. As I said, I'm sure our listeners have found it really useful. So, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us today. They're all the questions and comments that have come in. So I will now close the webinar.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody.
All right.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.